Hi everyone and welcome to this Pixel tutorial video. One of the most common questions I get asked from new Pixel users is how can they deploy their Python functions in Excel to other Excel users. Now often these other Excel end users are not Python specialists or Python developers, and a concern people have is that every user will have to install Python or will have to be comfortable configuring Python or that kind of thing. So first of all, deploying Python-based add-ins written using Pixel to non-technical users is a really common use case. And I've helped dozens of large enterprise Pixel customers to do exactly that. Very often, the end users don't even realize that the toolkit they're using in Excel is even written in Python. And to them, it just looks like a completely native Excel add-in, which is fantastic for them because it fits perfectly with how they already work, and it gives them the tools necessary for them to be really productive in Excel. Now, in this video, we're going to take a deep dive into how you can deploy your Pixel add-in for other non-Python users. We'll also look at how you can easily manage deploying updates so that all of your users are always on the most up-to-date version of your code. Before we get started, one thing to be aware of is that Pixel is licensed per user. So that means that if you're the sole developer using Pixel to develop an add-in and you want to deploy that to 4 end users, so 5 users in total, you would need a 5-user license. If you already have a license, you can add more users to your existing license at any time using the customer portal on the Pixel website. If you need any help or if you have any questions about your license, then please get in touch with us, and you can do that via the Contact Us page on the Pixel website. Okay, so to start off with, let's take a look at the end state that we're going to achieve. Now here I've got a folder called My Add-in, and it's in the Windows App Data folder, which is where I want my add-in to be installed when it's deployed on the end user's local PC. This could really be anything you like. It could be anywhere on the end user's PC, but App Data is a common place to put this. Now, in this folder, we've got a full Python distribution. So this includes, the Python runtime, but also any third-party packages and anything that our software requires. This is included here, so the user doesn't need to install Python themselves. And if they do already have another Python installed, that won't interfere with the Excel add-in because we'll be using this one. We've also got a source folder, which is where I've put the code for the Excel add-in. So I've just got a couple of Python files in here and a ribbon XML file. So this would be, all of your code that's supplying those functions that the end user needs. You could also package up your Python code as a wheel and install it into the Python runtime as well. But for simplicity, here I've just included this source folder. Now next to these, I've also got the pixel.xll file. So that's the actual Excel add-in itself. And then next to that is the pixel config file, which is the config file that configures the Pixel add-in. Now, if we take a look at the config file, we'll see that it's pretty minimal. We'll come back to this in some more detail later, as there are some other options that you might like to add. But what I want you to see right now is that the Python executable setting is set to the Python in our deployment folder. So that's this one here. And it's set relative to the location of the config file. So this means that Pixel will load our deployed Python, and the end user doesn't need to do anything to install Python in order for this to work. We've also got a couple of modules configured, and we've got the Python path set to our source folder, again relative to this config file. So no matter where this is installed, then everything should work fine. Now, when our end user launches Excel, the add-in loads, and they can see our custom ribbon tab, and they can call any of the Python functions that we've written for them, and without having to install Python or do any configuration. So here I've just got this simple ribbon set up, and in the source code here, if we look at this functions file, we'll see I've just defined one Python function called Python function, which I can call from Excel like this. Next, I'm going to show you exactly how we can arrive at that end state that we just saw. In this staging folder, I've got a simple Python installation set up, which you should be familiar with if you've already done some Python development and used Pixel. You might have these files in different places rather than gathered together in one folder, but that doesn't matter. I've just got them all in one place to make it a bit easier. I'm working with a venv here. You might be using a condarenv, or maybe you're just using a base Python install. I'm just using a venv because that's a common way to work with Python. But however you're managing your own Python environment, that's fine too. Now, everything else here looks pretty much the same as what we saw in that deployed folder that we looked at a second ago. I've got the pixel.xll file, and I've got the config file, and I've got my source folder. If we look at the pixel.config file, we'll see that I've got it configured to use the venv that I had in that folder, this vn scripts python here. In your file, this will look different because it will be configured to use a different Python environment. Like wherever you've got Python installed, it'll be showing that. That's fine. And then below, I've got the Python path set to load my Python modules from that source folder. And again, yours might look different here because you might be loading them from say an absolute path somewhere. You might not have your files in the same folder as your Pixel add-in. That doesn't matter, but in this case, I've got my source code here, and my Python is set to this venv. Now, if we were to just copy this whole folder to another user's computer right now, even if I copied it to exactly the same path, we'd see some errors when trying to load Python. That's because this venv isn't a complete Python environment. It relies on some components that it loads from the parent Python environment that it was created from. What we need to do is build a redistributable Python environment containing everything that's needed to run Python. And once we've got that, we can then simply copy it somewhere else and it'll work. If you're using Anaconda, then there's a tool called conda-pack that will do exactly that for you. It'll take a conda environment and then pack it and fix some things up and produce you just a zip file, which you can then copy and unzip somewhere else and it'll just work. So if you're using Anaconda, then I'd recommend taking a look at that. But I'm going to show you how to do basically the same thing, but without using any special tools, because it's not too difficult. And you don't have to be using a venv for this to work. This will work even if you're using just a normal base Python environment. It doesn't really matter what type of Python environment you're using. Now, the first thing we need to do is to get a list of the packages that we've currently got installed in our Python environment. We can do that by running a tool called pip freeze. So if I run this against my Python environment, it should tell me exactly the packages and the versions that I've got installed. So you may want to go through and clean up any packages you don't need or that kind of thing before you do that. But this is how we get a list of all the packages that we need. So I always recommend for any project keeping track of what packages you have installed, either by maintaining like your own list in a requirements.txt file, or using a tool such as Poetry, something like that. But then that way, when your Python environment gets messed up, you can simply just recreate a new blank Python environment and you can reinstall everything you need and there's no fuss. So anyway, running pip freeze tells us the requirements that we need for this thing, and we'll put that into a requirements.txt file since I don't have one for this environment already. So, whoops, requirements.txt, and there we go. And now I've got this requirements.txt file that tells us the packages that I need in this environment. Now what I'm going to do is install a completely clean Python runtime using the Python installer from python.org. If you already have a clean Python install, then you might be able to skip this step and use that environment instead. But let's just assume that you don't. So if I've already downloaded it here, and I'm going to select Customize Installation. I don't need the documentation for this. I don't need TK. I don't need the PyLauncher either. And here, I don't want to create the shortcuts either, but I want to customize the install location. And I'm going to put that in my staging folder. So I'm going to copy this path here. And I'm going to put it in a folder called Python 3.11 and hit install. Okay, so now that's finished. I've got a completely new clean Python environment. Now, this isn't a virtual environment, and so it's entirely self-contained. I can copy this anywhere, even to another PC, and it'll still work. It's a good idea to take a copy of this folder now, just so we can easily get back to this point later. So what I'm going to do is just zip this up into a new zip file. If you already had a clean Python environment, so you didn't run the installer as I did just now, you can zip up that Python environment too, so that you've got a clean copy of it before we start making changes. We're not quite done with this Python environment just yet. I still need to install the other packages into it using that Requirements.txt file I created earlier. This isn't a VM though, and I haven't added it to my system path. So if I just run pip, then that will use the wrong Python environment. Instead, what I can do is run the Python executable directly from where I just installed it. And instead of running pip, I can run python -m pip. So let me show you that now. In my command prompt, if I do, so this is finding the Python environment that I just installed and run mpip. What this will do is run this pip module from this Python environment. And this is a neat trick to run a Python module as a command, and it works in exactly the same way as if running that command directly by like typing pip, but I'm just using the specific Python environment I want in this case. So let's run this by adding the -r requirements.txt to install everything from that requirements.txt file I created earlier. Pip install I need to run. And now that's finished. We've got a complete Python environment with everything that we need installed into it. So now what we want to do is to update our pixel.config to point to that Python environment that we've just set up, and we'll do that using a relative path so that when we copy and move everything, then everything will be in the same place relative to the config file, so everything will just work. There'll be no config that the user has to set up. So back in the config file, you'll see I've got it set to my venv here, but what I want to do is, rather than that, set it to this Python 3.11 one, which is that one that we just created. So let's do that now. And then the Python path is already relative. So at this stage, if you do have your Python path set to be somewhere else on your computer, then now's a good time to move everything and make it relative so that you can have everything under one folder. So now what we can do is zip everything together. So we're going to want the Python runtime, the pixel config, the pixel add-in itself, and also our source folder. So in Explorer, pick those things, and then just add them to a zip file. So now this zip file contains everything that we need. It's got the Python environment, it's got the pixel add-in, and it's got all of our code. So we could just give this to someone else now, someone in our organization, and say, you know, open this zip file, unzip it somewhere, and then when you add the pixel add-in to your Excel, that'll all work. The only thing I haven't mentioned at this point is how to deal with the licensing. As I mentioned before, you know, it is licensed per user. So what I generally recommend to people is, if you've seen this already, you might see that in the config file, you would typically have a license section with a key saying your license key, whatever that is here. Instead of doing this, what I recommend is that you use a license file instead. So you can specify a file here and put this on a network drive. So, you know, your network share, this kind of thing, pixel license.txt, something like that. So that everyone that you want to be able to access this license file can then be permissioned using your permissions on the network share. And also, if you need to update it, then you can just update it in one place. You don't have to go around and update it on everyone's PC. And this file itself is just a plain text file. So you just create, you know, a plain text file using Notepad or whatever editor you're using, put in your license key, and that's all you have to do. And then Pixel will read it from this file on the network drive each time it starts, and everything will work fine. Doing it this way just helps you keep track of kind of who's got access to the license. And if you want to, if some person leaves and you want to reuse their seat with someone else, you can do that. You just have to give them access to this file, and it's it's much easier to manage that way. Okay, so let's see what this zip file would look like for a free user now. So what I'm going to do is just take this and copy it into just another empty folder. I just want to kind of go through like how a user would see this, and then we'll see what we can do to improve it. So first of all, we tell them to unzip it. So let's just go with the defaults. If I double click this pixel.xll file, then that'll open XL and load the pixel add-in. We can see here the add-in's loaded, and if I go to the About thing, which I included in the ribbon, you can see here it's actually loaded it from this deployment folder, and it's used the deployed config and all of that stuff, and we should find that the Python function that we created exists, so that's all working fine. However, this isn't really a great user experience from an end user point of view. They don't really want to have to go through downloading a zip file and unzipping it, and then having to double click the pixel.xll file each time they want to load the add-in. So next we're going to look at automating that whole process so that they don't have to do any of that. So the first part of that I want to show you is how to script actually installing the pixel add-in itself into XL. And we can do that with the pixel command line. So let's have a look at that now. If I go back to my terminal, and I just cd into that deployment folder, and then go into the pixel folder that we unzipped. Now what I can do is use the pixel command line tool to actually install that add-in into XL using the command PyXLL Activate. But what I'll do, rather than just running the pixel command, is I'll use that same trick that I used before of when I ran pip, of using that -m option to Python. So just to show you, if I type where pixel, this will show me that actually this pixel command, if I was just to run pixel, it would run it from this VM. So that's not what I want. I want to run it from this Python 3.11 folder in my deployment package. So to do that, what I'll do is run python.exe for my deployed one, -m pixel, and that will run that pre-installed pixel wheel that's in the deployed Python environment. And what I'll do is use this activate command, which will install the add-in into XL. So I'm just going to say activate this pixel.xl file. And now that's been successfully activated, next time we start XL, that add-in will be there already. There's one more flag to this which I just want to show you, which is non-interactive, and that flag basically prevents it requiring any user input. So if it was going to ask the user for anything, by passing that non-interactive switch to the command, it won't do that. So that's going to be useful when we transform this into a script, which will be run for the user. So if I just open XL now, we can see kind of as before, the add-in's loaded, but this time because the add-in's actually been installed, rather than just double clicking it, this will be loaded now every time XL starts. Now we've seen how to activate the pixel add-in and get the zip file with everything we need, let's put all that together in a script so that the user doesn't have to do anything other than just run a simple batch file. What I'm going to do is, I've got a folder here on my D drive called Pixel Deployment. So this could be like on a network share or on an intranet site or something like that. And I'm going to copy across the zip file that we created earlier. And in this same folder, create a new batch script to do the installation. So I'll call that install pixel.bat. And this would be the script that the end user would run to do the installation, or more likely it might be something that you would give to your systems team to have them run it either when the user logs in automatically, or for them to push it out and run it on behalf of the user on their machine. So I'll just edit this now. We'll start just by saying what we're doing. So first of all, we're going to copying the pixel files. And we'll just use the Windows Command X copy to do that. So I'm going to copy it from my pixel deployment folder. And I'm going to copy this to the app data folder for the user. So I'm going to use the environment variable app data to find that. And that'll be set correctly for each user. And we're going to do it into a folder called pixel. And I'll use the Y switch. This just tells the Xcopy command that if that folder already exists, then just overwrite everything in it without prompting the user. Next, we're going to have to unzip the files. And I use PowerShell to do that. You could write this whole thing as a PowerShell script if you wanted. And there's other ways you could do unzipping, but this is just an easy way. So we use the PowerShell command expand archive, and we'll give it the file name of the zip file that we've just copied across. And we'll give it the folder that we want to unzip it to. And in this case, we're just going to give it the same folder, app data pixel. And then we're going to install the add-in. So this is running we're going to run the PyXLL Activate command that we just saw in the last step. Again, from app data, what we want to do is in here, we're going to have, once it's unzipped, we'll have that Python 3.11 folder. So we can run python.exe like that, and then using the -m pixel trick. So we're going to call PyXLL Activate non-interactive, and then give it the file name of the add-in that we want to install. And that's it, we're done. So I'm just going to add a pause here so that the user can see what's happened. So we'll save that script, and then back in this deployment folder, all the user has to do, or the system's administrator, however they're going to run the script, is just run this, and you'll see that's copying across the file and then unzipping the files, and then it will install the PyXLL add-in. And so now we can see in the log that PyXLL's successfully been activated. It's been installed into this app data folder. Let's just have a quick look at that to see what's gone in there. And you can see it's just exactly the same contents of that zip file with the config and everything all pre-configured. So now when the user runs XL, we can see that our add-in is installed and everything's working fine without them having to do any kind of configuration or manual steps. Now, if you wanted to, instead of using a batch file as we just did, you could build an MSI or an installer. And the way that you'd do that is by bundling up exactly the same files that we did into the zip file into an MSI. And there are various tools that you can use to build an MSI. I'm not going to go into that in this video, but there are some instructions on the PyXLL website, so I'll link to those below. Before we finish up, there are a couple more things that I want to mention. And this is already quite a long video, so if you've got this far, then well done. I mentioned at the start that I wanted to talk a little bit about auto-updating and how you can keep your Python environment and your code and everything up to date. So I'm going to show you just a couple of ways to do that now, just by looking at the pixel.config file. I'm not going to go into this into too much detail, but there are more details online, and again, I'll put a link below about that. So in your PyXLL config, one thing that you might want to change, this is just the example config, so when you download PyXLL you'll get this example file rather than the cut down one that we were working with before. In here you can see kind of all of the available options, so it's quite nice to go through this and see what's there. One thing that you might want to use is this no user site flag. So the no user site flag is a standard Python flag. What it will do is it'll prevent Python from importing modules that are installed into the user's site packages. And that's kind of useful in this case where, we want to control the Python deployment. And so if they happen to have installed Python and if they happen to have installed packages into their user site folder, we don't want those to conflict with our one. And we can set this to 1 just, by uncommenting it and setting it to 1. And that will tell the Pixel add-in not to import anything from that user site package and only import stuff from the Python distribution that we've given it. The other thing I wanted to mention was this external config setting. This setting lets you list like a number of other config files to load in addition to the main pixel.config file. So we'd have, the main one with our sort of basic settings in here, but we could also go and specify under pixel external config, and we could give it like a list of config files to load in addition. So these could be on a network drive, for example, as as my network thing was here. So you could have something on your network share, like common.config, that kind of thing. So you could have a set of configuration settings that you want all of your users to have, but you could put it on a network drive so that if you want to make updates to it later, then you can just do that on the network drive rather than having to roll everything out again to each user. Also, if you've got like different levels of functionality, like if you've got an ops user and a finance user or this kind of thing, you can configure it to pick out just the bits of config that they need. So it's a nice way to be able to sort of separate bits of functionality. So I definitely recommend having a look at this if you are looking at a deployment. While we're talking about network drives and things, one other thing you can do is kind of a hybrid approach. So you could have an external config on a network drive, but you could also have your Python path include folders on a network drive. So if you had some files which you knew were going to be updated relatively often, then you might want to put those on a network drive and just have your users read it from there. And then you can update stuff really easily. There is one more thing that I just wanted to share with you, which is, again, this is kind of specifically for doing auto updates and this kind of thing. And that's this startup script setting. So what this is you can specify a script, so it can be a batch file or a PowerShell script that will run when the add-in starts. And this script runs before Python's even loaded, which is helpful because what you can do is you can write a script in the same way that we wrote, our install pixel.bat file. You could write an update pixel.bat file, and this startup script can either be you can install it locally, include it in your your bundle of things that you're installing. You could have an install script that then downloads some other updated script, or you could just point your startup script to be something on a network drive. So as things evolve, you can just keep that up to date. And your startup script could do things like it could look on the local file and say, oh, have I got these files already? If I have, then that's great. If I haven't, then download them. It could do things like check for a version number, so it knows to delete some old files or add some new files, that kind of thing, all from within this startup script. So startup script runs, updates your environment, pulls in any latest files, and then when the startup script's finished, then Python gets loaded, everything gets initialized, and the add-in finishes its loading. Another nice thing you can do with the startup script is actually configure Pixel itself. So you can issue commands from the startup script to do things like set configuration variables that Pixel will load. So for example, if you wanted to completely change the Python environment that was being used, you could have a startup script that downloads a new Python environment, unzips it, all of that stuff, and then actually sets the executable setting that we saw here to something else. So if you were upgrading from Python 3.11 to Python 3.11.1, you could download Python 3.11.1, unzip it, and then issue a command from your startup script to update the executable that Pixel uses to the one that's just been downloaded. So it's really flexible, and it's a way of kind of customizing how it starts up. So you can do all this kind of auto updating things how you want to within your organization. So that about covers everything that I wanted to talk about deployment and updating in this video. And I know it's been quite a long video and quite a quite technical and in-depth. So if you've watched this far, then thanks very much for watching, and well done. And if you have any questions about how you can manage the deployment within your organization, or we've got questions about the startup script or anything like that, then please do just let me know and I'll be happy to help.